All right, we are live. Let me make sure. Yep, we're live. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be seen by you all. My name is the Reverend Bryson White from Fresno, California. This is the Faith in the Valley Justice interview series. My role with Faith in the Valley is I'm the regional faith coordinator for Faith in the Valley, and I, along with Pastor Curtis Smith, we do work on engaging clergy and thinking with people of faith around the transformation of our congregations into vehicles for social justice. As an organization, Faith in the Valley and our community partners believe in a different and better future is possible for the Central Valley if we work together, a future in which everyone is included, treated as sacred, has a chance to thrive and live a healthy, decent life, a future in which no one is seen as less than or lives in fear because of the color of their skin, their legal status, or the amount of money they earn, a future where everyone has access to good jobs, clean air, clean water, alternatives to incarceration, quality healthcare, and safe neighborhoods. Today, you're with us for the Faith in the Valley Justice interview series, which are a set of conversations that highlight the role of faith and justice organizing in the Central Valley. We have discussed the role of interpretations of Christian scripture and its role in doing justice, the intersection between religion and mass incarceration, Christian perspectives on abolitionism, conceptions of nonviolence, Black and Palestinian solidarity, amongst other topics. Today, we have the honor to talk with a friend of mine, Daniel O'Connell, who is the executive director of the Central Valley Partnership, a regional nonprofit organization and progressive network of labor unions, environmental organizations, and community groups spanning the San Joaquin Valley. Trained as a multidisciplinary ethnographer, he holds a MS in International Agricultural Development from the University of California, Davis, and a PhD in education from Cornell University. As a politically engaged scholar, his work is dedicated to achieving social, racial, environmental, and economic justice in California. And so for all of y'all, you're all in for a treat with a good brother who has a great analysis of the Central Valley, a person of integrity who lives out what he believes. And we're going to talk a little bit about his latest book that he came out with, In the Struggle. And we're going to have a conversation about the intersection of his faith, his activism, and his scholarship. So welcome, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you this morning.
Bryson, it's such a pleasure to be here. We've been in dialogue for a long time, and now we get to have it in a semi-public forum, which is wonderful. I always enjoy these talks.
Indeed, yeah, I love talking to you, brother. So let's get started. And so for those who are tuning in, we've broken up our questions kind of within three categories of activism, faith, and scholarship. And we have some preset questions, but feel free to place some conversations into the question box on Facebook, and I'll try to get to them. Sometimes it's a little difficult to go back and forth, but I'll try to get to them and add them. And there will be some questions that maybe organically arise during the course of our conversation with one another. So the first question is under the bucket of activism. So Daniel, what is your personal history of activism, and what motivated your convictions, and what have you been committed to?
So first of all, just the frame of our talk today is with activism, faith, and scholarship is deeply integrated for me. They're almost inseparable in so many ways. As I've thought about the narrative and how to track it, it's difficult because they are so intertwined. The activism part of it, I'd say, really solidified as I left. I was raised in Orange County, California, the 1980s. So it was a very conservative area. I went to school at UC San Diego along the border and politicized around some border issues down there. I became an activist at that time. My father later told me that the UC system ruined me. And he was a little disappointed in the impracticality of activism. And so, I politicized around, especially the US involvement in Central America. The murder in 1980 of Archbishop Romero on the altar, the raping of nuns that were doing liberation theology with the church, was impactful to me, and a complete cut across the politics and values that I was told and immersed in when I was young. The border and immigration were present issues. I saw folks coming across the border all the time. There was many in the 1980s. And there began to be racist campaigns around the order that I began to politicize around. A racist previous mayor named Roger Hedgecock started politicizing that and having light up the border. We multiracial groups would go down and stand in front of these folks in their trucks at the border, things like this. And then the Gulf War started. I studied history at UC San Diego. And so books like The People's History of the United States by Howard and Noam Chomsky's thought were deeply impactful to me. Later on, years later, I was living in Santa Cruz. I was leading protests at the Resource Center for Nonviolence, a Gandhian organization, Christian nonviolence. We were shutting down freeways, etc. And I was angry. I was consumed by anger. In the back of that room was two 80-year-olds, a couple. They were joyous. They were always ready to be arrested, first in line, and so fearless. And I was angry and I think deep down afraid of what they were willing to do easily. And finally, I was just so compelled because the room is young people, young activists, and that were upset at these continual warfare. I said, "Who are you?" They said, "We're Quakers." We go to a Quaker meeting. And so finally I even said, "Where do you meet?" And they were so non-proselytizing, I just felt like, well, I don't know what Quakers are. I know their history. I know the Underground Railroad, their role in it, women's suffrage, peace work during Vietnam. So I was like, they have longstanding commitments, but I never followed through on that. After my son was born, I'm mellowing as I'm getting older. I started to attend Friends meetings. Which are very non-hierarchical. So Quakers meet in a flat structure where there's no preacher or book that we refer to necessarily. I remember when I was at Cornell at the Ithaca Friends meeting, they asked me to give a talk to their youth on activism. And what does it mean to be an activist? And I was so shocked that when I heard them ask me, I said, there's no disassociation anymore for me between my faith and activism. And so you see this, and there was more to it, but that was a very integrated walk, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But so I politicized, and I think there's just an innate listening to the voice, to our conscience, that I was open to.
Mm-hmm. And Quakerism helped facilitate your journey in that regard.
Quakerism is instrumental in that, so if you think of Roman Catholicism and its hierarchies, its patriarchy, its history of oppression, right, including the conquest and colonialism, very messy and ugly. Quakerism starts in the middle of the English Civil War with George Fox walking into churches to disrupt them, and Margaret Fell finally institutionalizing that. Quakerism is centered on empowering you and obligating you to follow the still small voice of God, which I would translate into our conscience. We are obligated to that. And so, for Quakers, or for me, truth, love, and God, all are synonymous words. And so at that level, what you understand is discerning what truth is, what God's message to us is not easy work. And I don't push that off or give that authority to other people at all. I hold that within myself. And I respect each individual is on their journey, whether they know that or not. Therefore, Quakers have a historic commitment to not killing people. And I think it's because we locate God in each person. We listen, we invite that dialogue between each other to discern together in a corporate way, in a corporal way, social way. So Quakers obligate the individual to follow their conscience, the still small voice of God. But at the same time, their decision-making is highly communal, in that we will not make a decision till everyone's in agreement. So Quaker decision-making could be called consensus in a political term, and is very slow. So we front-end democracy, if you will. All of the compromises and decisions are played out in front, not in litigation and fighting after the decision, with what you would have with a 50% majority vote or something like this. So Quakerism embodied the political philosophies that I started to animate my world. They operationalized it, and then they grounded it. Politics eventually wasn't enough, right? And so Quakerism grounded that practice for me. I would finally end with saying Quakers do this kind of community work well. They don't tell you and help you still yourself to meditate or pray. And there I integrated Buddhism in significantly. I've learned from Buddhism on how to meditate and pray.
So the spiritual formation side, I don't want to say the spiritual formation side because Quakerism and activism is a part of spiritual formation, but the meditative side might have been lacking within Quaker formation. So you supplemented that from another beautiful, long-standing tradition, spiritual tradition in Buddhism.
Yes, and after I arrived here in the Valley, I was raised in Orange County when evangelical white Christianity was dominant there and very reactionary.
And exploding in the Southern California.
Out from Orange County. I witnessed it at my high school, this kind of stuff. However, what a breath of fresh air to come to the Valley, to see organizations like Faith in the Valley, you and Andy Levine's work when I met you early on there in Fresno. And of course, very complimentary to the Friends, Peace Church of the Mennonites and Anabaptist theology. Just witnessing Anabaptists or Mennonites in their more social justice and nonviolent frame, because both Quakers and Mennonites have conservative edges to their traditions. So the first Mennonite church in Reedley, I became very close with the farmers out there, walking a walk through the Reedley Peace Center. So Anabaptism and other Christian work happening in Fresno salvaged Christianity for me. I had walked and distanced myself from it, even though Christ's message is probably the purest example of love and how to operationalize it, how churches were co-opting this in very repressive ways, very violent ways, and very racist ways, was disconcerting to me. And I found a Christian faith back by being in Fresno.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting because so you went from one kind of the epicenter of the explosion of evangelical politics in the 1980s to a region where in Central Valley where it's kind of like, Southern culture in California as well. But in that context, you were able to rediscover Christ, but not the Christ of dominance and the Christ of racist political discourse, but the liberative Christ. You know what I mean? That's cool that the Valley helped produce that, because so often like people can't discover that Jesus in the Central Valley, it seems. So I'm glad that there are folks who are discovering that. Yeah. So cool, Dane. Let's go to the second question. That's a part of activism and connected to the previous one. So I'm interested in your analysis. We've had a lot of really good conversations, and you provided a lot of just really good insight, keen insight to what's happening in the Central Valley. So from your vantage point, what are the primary forces in the Central Valley that are prohibiting the creation of a just and equitable region?
So I've spent 20 years on that. 10 years on a dissertation, doctoral dissertation, and another 10 years to kind of try to translate what is in academic language into a more accessible narrative for people to begin to understand. And so, both of us are being trained or trained as scholars. That doesn't necessarily mean that sometimes that training draws us away. Dispensationalism, by the way, which you use sometimes, I have to go look up. Like sometimes we use words that we within our communities of academics and scholars are so commonplace, and yet they're academic terms. And so, it's very important to translate this literally, hopefully in Spanish eventually and other languages, but to translate it into a more common and accessible language. Direct answer to your question, I would locate a major facet of our oppression. And I want to set this geography. The geography of the San Joaquin Valley is designed. By definition, geographies are designed by people. This geography is designed historically. It is endemically, historically, racially oppressive. That is probably common knowledge for communities of color here, but one of the things that we don't know is how is that oppression being structured? When my book arrived, my next door neighbor was here when the box arrived, and she asked with her husband, what is your book about? And I said, it's a critical history of the San Joaquin Valley and how to fight back. I could see I was already losing her. So I asked a question, why are poor people poor? You know what her answer was? Drugs. And I said, I see drugs as a symptom of it. And I said, my book is about the systems and institutions and structures that are oppressing people here. And I locate those in empirical findings and scientific research and in a narrative first-person voice of the scholars for over 100 years who worked here, and the repression and censorship and suppression of their data that happened through the federal government and the University of California. Imagine that the federal government paid for research to be done and immediately censored it and suppressed it when they didn't like the findings. You see the corruption happening of our public institutions, like public universities, like the University of California, and the federal government itself, operationally gearing up to move us away from small farming into industrialized farming. So I would say a major force of the San Joaquin Valley that's happening, operating here, is industrial agriculture. There is differences between the east and west sides of the valley. Plantation scale agriculture is more indicative on the west side of the valley. Most of us live on the east side of the valley, where the first settlers and colonizers put their towns. But the scale of agriculture has historically been smaller. The soils have been better. The availability of water on the east side is better, water rights, etc. So you have a slightly more democratic agricultural economy on the east side, though it's consolidating currently, to the west side. In answer to your question, also, I just wanted to I took some time to think about it, and I put it in these words. There is a functional form of feudalism, historically constituted and institutionally supported, framed by racial segregation, operating in the Central Valley today. It is active in the oppression of people, especially communities of color, as it corrupts public institutions and democratic processes. My book doesn't say this in me telling you this. It proves it in social scientific data sets and theory testing, scientific findings, and then you see the influence and pressure by agribusiness on the University of California and in the US government, weighing on these handful of scholars that I document. So the book does people's homework for them. It is still 300 pages. So I wanted to make it substantial, not too simple. My uncle the other day said it's heavy, and he's still working through it. That wasn't a critique. I wanted, just like the dissertation, you need it to be substantial to do its work as ammunition in the fight, right?
That's interesting. I never really, that's new to me. That analysis is new and really helpful and insightful about the differences between big ag on the east side of the valley and big ag on the west side of the valley. How does that sort of manifest itself? Like, would you be able to provide some examples of just like what that looks like, those differences?
So it is manifests itself in my work, but I'm going to say in academic scholarship first. the book opens with Walter Goldschmidt's study in the 1940s of a case comparison between Arvin and Dinuba. Arvin in Kern County, Dinuba in Tulare County. At the time, Arvin was surrounded by mega farms, large land holdings, still to this day, but DiGiorgio Farms, the largest agribusiness of its era, was surrounding Arvin in those years. And Dinuba, which was surrounded mostly by small farmers, similar to those around Reedley today and things like this, though there's a lot of pressure on those folks. The empirical case study asked the question, what is better for the economy and society? A town surrounded by large farms and a consolidated economy, an economy owned by a handful of people, or managed for the benefit of a handful of people, and or a diversified economy, one that small farmers were around. So Arvin was an unincorporated town. Dinuba was incorporated. Arvin had one school. Dinuba had a number of schools and a high school. Dinuba had more churches, more denominations, more PTAs, more newspapers, doctors. So they quantified both civic structures, such as civic groups like the Elks Club or anything like this, but more importantly, and probably most important, the small farmers were spending their money in the town. So the retail business in Dinuba was twice that of Arvin. So I sometimes put it this way, if you want to theorize in a very simple way, capital. If you want money, capital, flowing in a local economy as many times as possible before it leaves, right? So the small farmers were selling their goods and they were spending their money in town at small businesses and attending churches and participating in government, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas those few mega owners were located in San Francisco, LA, or New York. The capital flew out of Arvin, and therefore it affects everything. 4 out of 5 folks were entrepreneurial in Dinuba, I believe, whereas I think 2 out of 3 workers were migrant farm workers in Arvin at that time. So, it affects every single facet of this, and we'll get to it later on as we conclude kind of some of this findings. But and then finally, my own work. I moved here. I started living in Visalia. I came here wanting to engage on these issues that I had studied. Only now at the publication of my book, after 10 to 15 years of being here, am I really vocally talking about this. I kept on getting pulled into land use issues, smart growth issues, saving farmland, many of the myriad immigration and many of the other issues that play out on the east side of the valley. And there's been no traction really of people identifying entities like the Westlands Water District or the Bureau of Reclamation as targets to be engaged. They were too far above us, distanced and powerful for folks to engage. And we need to be able to name the objects that we want to transform and affect. And so I, in some ways, think that we as activists and organizers have not really even identified, named the true structural oppressive forces that are weighing down on us. And as we both know, there's a lot of infighting in the movement too, that takes a lot of energy.
That's right. Yeah, that naming and that unmasking of the powers is so critically important to develop the necessary strategies to undo their power. Because or else folks sort of have like the shallow analysis of your neighbor of, oh, it's just drugs, you know what I mean, or it's just crime, you know what I mean, or is this, whatever sort of symptomatic response that folks may have to the larger pressures that they're responding to. So if we don't do the requisite public education, to unmask, sort of the man behind the curtain, if you will, folks won't really know how to move and how to address the power structures that be. Yeah, I'm hearing you, Daniel. So one of the next question that we have is around your faith background and journey, but we've already touched on that a little bit. So I'm going to jump into the second phase of the question around faith, if we can do that.
Yeah.
So from your vantage point, what is the intersection between faith and oppressive power in the Central Valley. You made mention a little bit earlier as when you came into the Central Valley, or actually from what you experienced in Orange County, and then from when you came into the Central Valley, you saw this sort of intersection between faith and, you know, deeply racist tropes, et cetera. But from your vantage point, what is the connection between the two?
So as I've been thinking about this, there's two sides to this question, which you've already started to touch upon. And I think that you found it slightly ironic that I was able to re-engage my own Christian faith by coming to a region that I think it sounded like to me that you did not feel that in some ways that it expressed that. So there is a lot of ironies there. And I wanted to say, what does the Valley look like from outside as well, from an academic point of view in my discipline before I get there, is it looks like all farmers are bad, quote unquote, which is absolutely not the case. And in fact, most farmers are called farm workers. It's just that in English, we have two names for them because that in that discourse in language embodies our racism and the oppression that's happening, that we have our true farmers being called farm workers, which automatically in your mind comes up to a racialized. And the Valley presents itself from outside as being reactionary, as Devin Nunes and McCarthy territory of bright red or whatever. This is not true. We know it's there's a movement on. And it also presents historically, and you use the word Southern or white. And I would say, and this is drawing from Isao Fujimoto's work, are we discounting our strengths? That the Valley is extraordinarily racially and ethnically diverse. Yeah. There is our basis of work, and it's deeply an interfaith network of commitments and values and principles. So the first side of this is, I think that I just want to name the oppressive side of this. How is faith and oppression happening here? So I was on a dialogue with Pastor Binion recently, a few weeks ago, talking about some of these issues. And I think it's important for white European folks to be naming what's happening in our congregations and churches, that particularly during these last 4 years, white evangelical churches have played a part in an attempt to really undermine democracy in a place where our neighbors often are undocumented. Remember how the Bible invites us to welcome the sojourners in our land and asks us not to oppress them. This is exactly happening here. And it's historic. It started with Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos. It started with the American conquest of California with Native peoples, a genocidal attempt. The state of California was paying for scalps initially in the 1870s here. We know that folks from Mark Arax's work, the Southerners came in to plant cotton. Some African Americans came with them. We have wonderful historic places like Teviston or Fairmead or Allensworth that expresses that in community sense. So I think that we as European descent, white folks of faith, have a fire in the house, and it's very incumbent upon us to name it in very and I think we should do it in even disruptive ways increasingly, but that's me, and I'm not necessarily trotting out to do that yet. I'm more working from the base of where I spent 20 years, and I use faith as a bulwark of my personal groundingness and centeredness rather than as a political frame. But I did want to turn to the other side in our American history of the liberatory aspects of faith, and especially Christianity. And that is embodied, I think, in the Black and African American traditions of the church. And we see it deeply, deeply in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the infusion of how nonviolence was taught in SNCC and during the Civil Rights Movement, that Martin Luther King was the leader of that movement, and that communities of faith and leaders of faith were the foundation of that. And I see that here today, and then continuing today with many of the African American pastors that are in Fresno, West Fresno, leading the way and calling out the injustices that their communities are experiencing. So I'd say the liberatory tradition of faith is best expressed in America, in California, and in the Valley through the African-American tradition and churches in Christianity, which we continue to benefit from. Finally, I did want to just mention from my own perspective, personal, it's very important to look back at the Gandhian experience in the revolution and the independence of India. Gandhi's method and Gandhi's approach was a deeply spiritual. Martin Luther King reframed the word satyagraha as soul force when he spoke, but certainly Martin Luther King had his eyes on how effective Gandhi was in India just prior to the American Civil Rights effort and borrowed from it. Satyagraha, I would translate from Sanskrit into truth force. Again, the combination of love, truth, and God intersecting here is very interesting. And I actually take that triangle of synonymous words from Gandhi. I believe he did say the same. I learn from and greatly value the experience that Gandhi did in South Africa, confronting the Afrikaners, and then applying it to the most powerful empire in the world. The Afrikaners, the Boers, were not easy folks to bring to their knees. He did, only to a certain extent to the benefit of his Indian community there, but still lessons learned that he then came back to India and applied against an empire as powerful potentially as our own government, which is a mixed case, because I think there's great aspects to our government and still democratic threads there. But I think as we look at a power structure as imposing as that sits upon us in the San Joaquin Valley based in industrial scale agribusiness, we can gain lessons and including the working community, joyful work, through love and care for each other, as we engage in some of the most oppressive structures we have seen in our country's history here. Nothing like what happened in the South, but still formidable here and still strengthening. And though we're punching back now pretty well. So I'd say that there is a liberatory tradition of faith that I follow. Catholicism even has them expressed in liberation theology and the resistance that happened in Central America. For instance, the Franciscans, I always appreciated and liked the intellectualism of the Jesuits. We have our first Jesuit Pope, which take the name of Francis and is doing some pretty cool stuff for a church that's been pretty crusty for a long time. So there's a liberatory tradition in all faiths, and including Baptist. And the Baptists just voted not to go further extreme in America, and I'm really happy about that. And then there's this oppressive side that has functioned in history. The white Afrikaners were extraordinarily religious. The Dutch Reformed Church functioned somewhat similar as the Southern Baptist Convention here in America, very similar. And of course, Catholicism with its implication in conquest as well. So I think that we have a lot of problems in our churches and that we need to engage those forcefully.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent. Thank you for that thorough and comprehensive answer. And I agree. What you said a lot. There's a couple pieces that stood out at the very beginning when you talked about sort of the history of California and the Valley, Confederate soldiers bringing Black folks to the Valley, the way the Valley, California hunting native indigenous scalps, Chinese folks being discriminated against and oppressed in all the different ways that you name. One of the things that's interesting and sort of the unmasking of California's history is, I remember when I was a kid, our elementary school would take us to the Civil War reenactment out there at Kearney Park. And I never knew how racist that was. You know what I mean? Like, we went out there and we thought it was cool because they were shooting off fake cannons and people were in uniforms fighting. I had no idea about the racial claim that reenactment is making, right? And I think there's so many components that we get formed in the Central Valley without having a racial analysis. We all, it's standard for elementary school students, at least when I was going to school. I don't know if this is the case anymore, to go to missions, right? And there is no sort of like direct, conversation with your teachers about, what the missions were doing to indigenous folks, right? It was just the building is cool, the discoverers came and did X, Y, and Z. And so I think what you're naming about this sort of unmasking of the history of the Central Valley is critically important. And I think that our faith institutions have a key, an important role in that type of unmasking of histories. And I don't think that we have currently kind of comprehensively done a great job at unmasking those histories. We just sort of let them be without pulling the curtain, unveiling the curtain. An example too about like the way these histories go untouched. I remember, and I'll keep this quick because I know we're at 11:35. A couple of years ago, a major congregation, white congregation in Fresno, brought out Oliver North, right, to be a keynote speaker to the congregation. Now, Oliver North, isn't someone who's necessarily connected directly to the Central Valley, but Oliver North is directly tied to the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s, and the bloodbaths that the U.S. government was funding in Central America through the drug trade by partnering with U.S.-based drug dealers, right? So the Iran-Contra scandal brought so much so much cocaine into Black inner city communities, and yet here you have this white evangelical church honoring Oliver North as an American sort of icon who's tied directly into the oppressive, to the destruction of Black communities. And so, and no one really said anything about it too. You know what I mean? Like, hey, like why are you bringing Oliver North out here? And so I'm only bringing that up to say, not to even just scapegoat this particular congregation, but to say that there's so many narratives at play in our congregations that are going unexamined, uninterrogated. And a part of my role, we can move on after this, and with Faith in the Valley and with folks like yourself and other partners, I think the beautiful role that we have as a part of being rooted and grounded in faith is to expose our congregations to a more liberative theological framework and a more liberative analysis, so we can step into doing that deeply transformative work that people would do more of if they knew more of. You know what I mean?
I just wanted to mention in academic sense, this favoritism of objectivity. Objectivity is always a default to the power structure's position, right? Because they own the center of the discussion. So if you calling people to an objective point of view, not to situate yourself either in solidarity or as a person who have experienced harm in their personal life. And I just wanted to say that this kind of masking then happens in academic disciplines. So how history is taught, and if you looked at any high school textbook, and you can see this happening now in the United States, it's extraordinarily a politicized document, how history is told. And even in major universities, which are, I'd say, have a broader liberal tradition. So the emergence of ethnic studies coming from the 60s and 70s, and the various versions of African-American studies, Asian American, et cetera. And now this attack that's happening on critical race theory, right? Once folks of color realized they weren't going to easily turn these major disciplines of sociology or history into a more critical disposition, we did manage to succeed during the civil rights movement to carve out spaces where critical discussions could happen. And of course, this actually funds many, many positions as well. So is critical race theory, is it not simply the true history of our country? And the history that's taught to most folks is a masking of the oppressors, right? And so now you see them coming after us and critical race theory. We have an attack on how to even discern objective reality in and of itself. In the midst of a pandemic, we have politicians telling us not to wear masks, the most polite thing you could ever do and very effective. We would have stopped this early on if we would have just worn masks. So, and now the politicalization of science is now bleeding out into every single way. And I would say that folks, both from a theological or religious point of view, and academic and scholars and political, have lost many of the, especially working class folks, have lost their story. And if you lose your story, you're not going to be able to situate yourself in the world and to understand it. And so how do we invite people back into a broader version of that, especially as difficult as it is talking across lines of race and faith? And yet I think, and especially because of the work of Faith in the Valley, that is occurring, and we should celebrate it. It's not just that we're getting our asses kicked; we're taking ground.
That's right. Yeah, and I think people, yeah, that's a great word, an encouraging word, because so often as organizers, activists, you can sort of have a doomsday approach of like, oh, it's not transformed, so we haven't made any headway, and that's simply not true. That there is something brewing in the Central Valley and has been brewing for a while and gaining more headway.
And isn't there liberation in the struggle itself? As scholar, I think that the further you are from the problem, the more your research arcs towards conjecture, because you're not actually within it. But as a community of faith, as spiritual beings, to link arms in contexts of oppression with folks that are vulnerable, in deep solidarity and affinity, to even potentially suffer and sacrifice with them, we only view that as a negative. I think there's incredible joy in that, an unexplored joy that Christ actually invites people into. And this is happening here, and it doesn't have to be even dramatic. Just seeing dialogues that happen across lines of historic difference can be uplifting to me. And they happen very often here. And I just, again, thanks especially to the work of your organization.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you, Dan. Yeah, one of the things, and I want to move into some more questions in line with what you're just talking about in terms of your scholarship, is, you mentioned, this, the new boogeyman of critical race theory, right? And this notion of is critical race theory. I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, it is the true history of the country. It unmasks the true history of the country, but too many Christian congregations, Christians in this country, are so readily to dismiss critical race theory. We all know the racial implications and what's behind that. But they've also embraced a faith that has de-radicalized the central figure of their faith. They've created an alternative history to the New Testament itself. And so, they are more easily and readily moved into either an ahistorical kind of understanding of things, or a what's the word, a whitewashing, you know what I mean, of history, because Christ was, Jesus was crucified at the hands of empire. You know what I mean? James Cone said it so pointedly in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, that Jesus and the lynched body of the Black person in the U.S. South are synonymous, right? And so if you can't, see the two, you're going to miss the message of Christ. And I think, when we have a faith tradition that has de-radicalized its central figure, defanged its central figure, not understood the connection between its tradition and empire and the way it was co-opted, it's going to always reproduce its co-optation and its linkage with oppressive structural realities. And so the work of pulling that apart is an arduous task, but it's necessary to create that consciousness amongst clergy in the Central Valley, amongst leaders in the Central Valley, to really help people with the new and different language to draw on the best of our traditions to deepen our the prophetic message of Christianity. And that's not just the sense of Christianity. That's even for those in other faith traditions as well, who have the liberative strains in their traditions to draw on them as well. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add that to some of your comments. Yeah, so cool. Thank you. So we're at about 11:45. We have a little bit more time left. So I wanted to center to back more to your conversation on your text and on scholarship, so we can get right into that. What was the impetus behind your co-authored book? Which, by the way, you all, I didn't give the full title before. Daniel's co-authored text is called "In the Struggle: Scholars and the Fight Against Industrial Agribusiness in California." So what was your impetus behind co-authoring that text, Daniel?
I had been an activist for 20, 30 years, and we weren't making any change. And I had participated in everything from direct action to letter writing campaigns, everything. And so I was frustrated at that level. I also was coming out of a Peace Corps stint in Namibia, post-apartheid Namibia, where I'd spent 3 years with a government. The SWAPO government had won in its independence struggle. But mostly I was looking for ways to do relevant work and be more effective as an activist or as a human, and to have more of an impact as a human being. I feel like I've been given a lot. I was going to give back. So the book is also a walk towards dedicating myself to a life of service, which was always there for me, to explore and commit to a vocation. And maybe I feel blessed at that, but I also think that we should all be at that level, a certain way of reflexively looking at our lives and seeing what are we living for? Because it's really brief. I wanted beauty in the world, and I wasn't seeing beauty. And we have a lot of control over creating beauty on an individual level. Finally, the book and its impetus is, I'm from California. I wasn't going to be able to impact Namibia, nor probably should I. And they were doing just fine, by the way, and building after apartheid there. I came back, and during my master's work at UC Davis, I began to understand as an ethnographer, looking at social segregation, institutionalized racism that was happening in community institutions in a farm worker town, that apartheid, yes, 30 years distance, was still active here in my own country and in my own state, and that the most worst expression of that was the Southern San Joaquin Valley. And I then began to want to, finally, I realized that a role that I could have as a scholar was to delineate and map the structures. I had enough of a I was raised well off enough. I even moved back to my folks' house for a few months to write my dissertation in my 30s. It's pretty humbling. Most people don't have that option. And also I had managed to negotiate getting into an Ivy League school that I wanted to use the credentialing of that to create ammunition, and which we did. I did in the dissertation. So the dissertation is called "In the Struggle: Pedagogies of Politically Engaged Scholarship in the San Joaquin Valley." I theorized in my work how to be an activist, how to do political work as a scholar, if you will. But at the same time, the work functions to map and delineate this structure, to better understand it, to confront it, and to transform it, this structure in the San Joaquin Valley based in industrial scale agribusiness. It's there now. For anyone who wants to see it, it's there. And so now I'll be going out to small community groups and starting to tell them about it slowly over the next year, and I'll be giving broader talks at universities as well.
That's crucial. So your scholarship isn't just resting behind paywalls and journal articles that people can't access, but it's really emerged from and also speaking back to the communities that have deeply shaped you, radicalized you, and radicalization meaning that in the best sense of the word, you know what I mean? So it's in the struggle, like in the title of your text. Now I appreciate that. We need more scholars who are deeply connected to communities, because the academy sort of naturally tries to pull you into the space of saying, no, you need to publish in these sorts of publications. You need to put out books that no one really understands. You know what I mean? You need to, have your administrative tasks at your institution rather than being really rooted in communities, or you won't get tenure and you won't get financial stability. You know what I mean? And so I'm always appreciative of encountering scholars like yourself who are amongst folks. And that's not to only just even to disrespect people who are doing the work of high theory, because we do need folks doing that too, because the oppressive worlds that we are navigating and living and moving amongst were also constructed theoretically. So we do need people arguing at that level as well. But we need a few more folks on the ground. You know what I mean?
We need both. The Italian communist Antonio Gramsci was very influential to me as he organized folks in Italy in the 1920s as fascism grew there. And he called people to be organic intellectuals.
Yep.
And so, I do, there is a role, especially for folks from communities of color and women in our major universities, in a critical role there. And we need both campus-based work and theoretical work and applied practical work. My invitation is, there's a lot of folks on campus. My invitation is for campuses to get students and faculty out in community more. The closer you are to being in the struggle, the better. And I think the better the research as well.
Yeah, I was transformed by both. I was transformed growing up with my grandfather, my dad, and my mom, from being in my mom's second grade classroom to being with my dad, giving speeches and being amongst people, and my grandfather's preaching in congregations and marching with them when I was younger, to being in the classroom where that's where I encountered James Cone through Dr. Ralph Watkins. You know what I mean? And that's when I came across Black liberation theology, and in undergrad with Professor Nicholas Dungy. That's where I came across, political theory, you know what I mean? And that's when I started organizing on college campuses, doing student government, so both spaces have deeply shaped me and formed me. Not, the street, the academy, and the church, those three, you know what I mean, have formed me. And so I'm just deeply appreciative of each mentor in each avenue who's exposed me to things I didn't know anything about.
I think it's important for people to realize what is theory. For me, you could also say strategy. And remember, when I came in, I was using a lot of tactics and methods. But if you don't know where you're going, if you haven't named the path, or you can't refer to other paths and journeys that people can show you, you're going to be off target, right? And so theory, I often say to organizers here in the Valley, when you're ready, because organizers have a unique skill set that I think can be transformed into a scholarship. I say to them, when you're ready, when you burn out, when you hit that ceiling, you take a sabbatic from this work and you go to graduate school.
Yeah.
Sabbatic is to graduate school. And then your choice on where you want to go, but hopefully come back, but at least treat yourself to that. And we need to make higher education more affordable. But in any case, that I do think that there's a deeply important role for theory to play, but often sometimes might think of it as just being strategic.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's really good. That's a good word of wisdom that you are giving folks as well. So I have two questions. The second one I think is the one that we haven't, that I would personally like to hear more about, but I'll let you choose. So one question is, what are your book's main purpose and findings? You've touched on that a little bit. And the second question is, could you summarize the vision that you have around land and economy in the Central Valley? What would it be?
Let's just combine those given time.
Yeah.
In the conclusion, in italics, is this quote: an equitable economy is both a necessary condition and measurable outcome for a democratic society. An equitable economy is both a necessary condition. If you're going to have democracy, it's better to have a middle class, and a measurable outcome. If you witness hunger in the midst of the most productive food producing region in the history of the world, and the hungriest people are the farm workers who are picking the fruit and the crops, imagine that the immorality of that. Man. And that is going on today, here, now, literally today in 106 degrees temperature. That's happening now. So if we're going to have a democracy, and I don't want to name necessarily, we'll get to a few ideas, but you need to have an equitable economy. And if you have an equitable economy, it insulates your democracy from being undermined as well. And you could put it in an agricultural system. Monocultures are terrible for ecologies, and they're terrible for agricultural systems too. The Irish were farming only 4 varieties of potato, and a fungus hit, and 2 million starved, 3 million immigrated. Monocultures are bad, but monocultures are also bad in human culture. To have white supremacy be the frame of our culture undermines everything, and we see it now in the complete erosion of our civic and moral life in our country. So monoculture, both in ecological, agroecological, and human systems, is bad, and therefore diversity is good. Second, the book teaches people how to resist and fight back. Again, to offer pedagogies, you'll see it. It is, and especially if you're a teacher, or you're a lecturer or a professor or researcher, but it's applicable to others, journalists, preachers, pastors, any person that's using scholarship or knowledge in and of itself. Scholarship is the production of knowledge, right? So anyone who's using knowledge, that's everyone, could benefit from the book, and the book will teach you how to use knowledge to resist your own oppression and to promote liberatory practice. And finally, the book establishes a set of values and principles on which to stand. And that really can be talked about in the sense of what is democracy, and what do we need as values to support a democracy. I'll shift to the last question quickly. So the vision around land and the economy in the Central Valley, it's more encompassing than the Central Valley, but I'm here and I'm fighting for this here and now. But I need to start with simply stating the history of the United States starts with the genocide. 500 nations were here, that happened. And it starts with the slave trade. And the capital accumulation of slavery, of using African labor to accumulate capital, was instrumental in the creation of our economy here, which is highly unequal and getting worse right now. There's been periods of progressive reform. We need to move back into that. So progressive movements are those that express the public interest. And I think the public interest is best expressed in an equitable economy, right? Since race is so implicated in our inequality, it needs to attack race and gender issues. So an intersectional engagement, but a key facet of it is the economy. We could go back to the African-American experience, and the promise that happened after hundreds of years of slavery was 40 acres and a mule. Under American law, the Homestead Act and the Reclamation Law stipulated farms in 160 acres or less. And when the Midwest was, yes, stolen land, but was colonized with 160 acres, for the first decades of Kansas was the most progressive state in the United States. It's the most reactionary now, right? The Grange movement, and so Nebraska, Kansas, these places at the turn of the century were the most radically progressive states. Now they're the most reactionary. I think it's because they've lost their economy. Main streets have atrophied into ghost towns, in effect, and they've lost the basis of their democracy. So 40 acres and a mule, this promise of a diverse economy, or enough to subsist on. So can we promise an economy where everyone can subsist with dignity? Isn't that the basis, the bare basis of what we'd want in a democratic society? I think it is. So it's difficult, I put it this way, to prescribe what a care and sharing economy looks like. We need to co-construct that. I'm going to just mention a few points of reference. Even when I was doing community development in Namibia, I did not want to offer false hopes for folks that are already having a difficult time understanding things. I like community land trusts, CLTs. They decommodify land or bring it out of speculation. They're highly equitable institutions. They mostly function in urban centers where affordable housing is not easy, but they could be used. And the first community land trusts, which were coming historically out of the Gandhian movement and out of the kibbutz and moshav movement in Israel, was an African-American farm of 5,000 acres in the South. So I won't go into community land trusts, I'll just reference it. For immigrants from Mexico after the revolution, they're ejidos. Communal indigenous land sharing was institutionalized after the Mexican Revolution. NAFTA eventually attacked them. They're still functioning where many of our own farm workers are from, Oaxaca and places like this. Ejidos, I also lived in Africa where land was held communally as well when I lived in the north of Namibia. And finally, the idea of something like a food commons. What I mean by that is beginning to name and conceptualize a regional community-owned food system. You could also do it with energy, because anything that produces things, energy with solar or wind or food, are easily microly produced. If they're microly produced, we can vertically integrate like a corporation, but instead of profit extraction. So if you're producing food, you'd want that food sold to a food co-op where young people are working in West Fresno, and decision-making is made by those 30 workers. And the distribution system coming from that, you'd want that community-owned, maybe a nonprofit, other things. Where and how do cooperatives and land trusts function to build an implementing infrastructure for justice and equity? There's where we are right now after our history of advocacy and activism here in the Valley. Let's implement equity, and finally, let's put it on a very grounded way. The spheres of influence of cities. I've done a lot of advocacy around land use. The racism in sprawl is extraordinary. We're producing $500,000 houses on quarter-acre lots. Why aren't the spheres of influence, which we as a society have agreed to destroy this precious farmland, why aren't we choosing to call these equity zones? And each parcel that LAFCOs, local agency governing, they govern the transactions between county and cities. Why aren't we infusing, if we're permitting as a society the commodification or transition of these and the development of these lands, why aren't we laying on top of those conservation, racial justice, economic equity provisions? And we can do it through things like urban growth boundaries, or contesting each of these as they're brought through the process. We need to begin to be more strategically smart in holding a very high bar to our activism. We're at the cusp of realizing justice here in the Valley. And if we can turn the Valley, which I'm optimistic we're going to do in 10 or 15 years, therefore it holds hope for the Midwest, for other places that have been oppressed. Our multiracial interfaith work is cutting a model that can be applied in other places in the world, in our country, and in our state.
Oh yeah, well, thank you so much for that concluding word, Daniel. I really, there's so much more that we could talk about. You know what? Actually, before I conclude, would you mind? I know you said, for the sake of time, you didn't want to mention what a land trust was. For folks who are listening, would you mind just explaining what a land trust is?
So if we want to share land, it's too cumbersome and difficult to have the government do it. State parks, they often lock us off of the land when they do bring in parks. It's how do we move faster in an era of extinction and climate change and this necessity to address justice and equity? I think a land trust is a nonprofit that's charged with stewarding land. Simple enough. And by the way, any nonprofit can own land. There is African-American institutions in South LA that own many infrastructures coming out of the civil rights movement. We can begin to own a hybridized form. What are these parcels around the edges of our city? They're 5 to 100 acre parcels. What does it look like to purchase those through a nonprofit, maybe with public funds, and to build an eco-village? A co-housing development. We have a co-housing development next to the UUs. It's the design structure and the decision-making structure. On about 5 acres, you have a co-housing that might be Mixtec or Hmong or working folks or a mixed group of folks. And then on the other 100 acres, you have a community farm that some people are working on. Maybe you have value-added production of kimchi or sauerkraut or salsas that are happening there. Those are being sold and exported. We need to, and this African Americans are at the forefront of demanding an economy that functions for them. And so more than any other community, I think, because of the theft that's happened from their labor and from their enslavement, we need an economy that's owned by us. And when I say us, is not necessarily people that look like me. I want to be there and help out, but it's folks that have been oppressed, communities of color, and diverse communities, and interracial communities. So a land trust can steward land, and a community land trust, most land trusts purchase land and put it into a nature preserve. That's a conservation land trust. A community land trust owns the land and it leases the infrastructure, the house or the barn, at a 99-year inheritable and renewable contract. So what is land? Here's the equity proposition of a CLT. Land, when you buy a house, most of the value of your land is in the land. So if I buy a $200,000 house, probably $160,000 is in the land. $40,000 is in the house. Under English common law, you can't disassociate ownership of the house from the land. So you have this 99-year lease, which is past your own lifetime. That lease is inheritable by your children. And so that contract begins to get you to where you can own the house separate from the land. And therefore the house costs $40,000. So rather than renting, why is the housing authority keep renting to people? I don't want renters. I want a hybridized form of ownership, not renters. I'm glad enough that homeless people are housed, but I want homeless people to be owners. I want a shared ownership of the society. How do we structure that? Community land trust will get us a certain way there.
And so this is a part of the process of guaranteeing a home for every person in this country.
We do not have a democracy if we have homelessness. That's not a functioning democracy, because homeless don't have an address to vote. This is almost a design, by the way, to have this level of dislocation. And when you have this level of homelessness, you have, again, disorientation, such desperateness. How are you going to name these bigger structures? We cannot tolerate this stuff anymore. And it's not just about housing somebody. It's vesting themselves in the society, in our co-ownership of our life world, co-ownership, including beyond humanity, probably, to share that life world with other living things as well. So there's other epistemologies that would come in, but at the very basis, for people to understand, getting folks to be vested in our society. If we're going to have a democracy, we can't have this poverty, we can't have homelessness and desperation and hunger.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, now this is an excellent conversation. There's so much to think about. For everyone who tuned in, we're so grateful for you to tune in. If you ask questions on Facebook, I'm sorry, I was so enthralled with the conversation, I didn't actually go and check. But you can, we're going to house this on the Faith in the Valley website. It will always be on our Facebook page also, but you can also find it on our Faith in the Valley webpage for you to come back. And I would encourage you to come back and listen and take some of the key points and key learnings that you're hearing from Daniel. And then also I wanted to replug Daniel's book, In the Struggle, Scholars in the Fight Against Industrial Agribusiness in California. And you can Google that and you can find where to purchase it. And if you can purchase it from a place not Amazon, do that. But yeah, so we're grateful for you, Daniel. Thanks so much for spending some time. And yeah, so folks, I hope that you all were took away some key learnings from a robust conversation. So again, thank you, and we'll talk soon, brother.
Talk to you soon. Thank you so much.
Peace.